This is a new paradigm in MMA conditioning and will change the way that you train to maximize performance in the cage, not gas out, and not take unnecessary damage. If you haven't got it already, down in the description, there's the MMA strength and conditioning blueprint. Now that blueprint doesn't run through everything that I'm going to run through in this video. I tried to make that blueprint more practical for you so you can go through it and apply the concepts. I'm going to take a deeper dive into conditioning now within this video. It's going to give a broader aspect around that conditioning, but also tie it back into that practical aspect. So make sure you grab that, because that book lays out everything else around strength training as well if you haven't already got it. But to start this, we're going to start with a needs analysis of MMA. And I've got my laptop here as I did with my last video, because I've got a bunch of notes in this that will be helpful for you. So when we're talking about MMA itself, the UFC Performance Institute, they came out with their own data. There's also data around regional MMA. Typically, we're looking at anywhere from 1 to 2 to 1 to 4 effort to pause ratio, meaning for every 1 second of work, you're getting 2, 3, or 4 times longer in a pause or a rest state. And within the UFC, it seems to be around 1 to 3 to 1 to 4, regional 1 to 2, 1 to 4. So we're looking in that range. Now, that's typically around 6 to 14 seconds of high intensity work, and then 2 to 4 times longer of that in terms of pauses. We must remember this is an average, so you don't want to program all of your conditioning around these averages, but this just gives you an idea of what occurs during an MMA fight. Now, what's most important from this data is the UFC broke down these high intensity periods. They found that 77% of all UFC fights are ended in this little window of the 6 to 14 seconds. Within the UFC, it's 8 to 14. Within regional, we can go down to as low as 6, just from the data that we have currently. So these small high intensity windows is where fights are typically ended, which gives us an idea that high levels of power output and the ability to repeat that power output becomes very important for MMA success. Now, if we go into some of the research around MMA conditioning, there is a meta-analysis from Bueno, hopefully I said that right, in 2002, and his colleagues. And they state that the energy supplied for MMA is primarily from the oxidative phosphorylation system. So aerobic energy system, to put in layman's terms. So does that mean then that we should hit the roads, be doing long miles like traditional conditioning is done? Or is it time to ditch this traditional energy system model? And to set the scene, I'm gonna run you through some of the physiology around high intensity intervals. So bear with me. I'm not doing this just to throw a bunch of random science at you. This is going to lay the platform for when we move down further into this conditioning rabbit hole. But if we look at the physiology of one single sprint, now typically when we're talking about energy systems in the traditional model, you probably know alactic, anaerobic, aerobic is what we're traditionally taught. Alactic lasts 0 to 10 seconds. And then we have the anaerobic glycolysis or anaerobic lactic energy system, and that's 10 to 40 seconds. And then we have the aerobic energy system, and that just takes over anything long duration. And that's kind of how we view energy systems overall. This assumes that anything that is done anaerobically is without oxygen, and assumes that energy systems work in isolation. Now, the problem is energy systems never work in isolation. All three energy systems are always working. There's an interplay between them based on the intensity of the exercise. Further, there's no exercise or conditioning activity that you do that is without oxygen. There are some processes that occur that don't need oxygen, but oxygen is always present. So in terms of terminology, it gets a little fuzzy there, but I think this graph I'm gonna put up here now illustrates this concept best, and this idea around we can't just be looking to slog miles or focus on one energy system at a time when we're looking to do conditioning. And this is just taken one 30-second sprint, and you're looking at the energy contributions from those 3 different energy systems. So we see that up to 6 seconds in this particular graph. So we have light green, which would be considered our alactic or PCR energy system. Then we have the, I guess it's a moderate green, I'm just calling it moderate green, and that will be considered our anaerobic lactic or glycolysis. And then we have the dark green, which would be the oxidative or aerobic. And we see even at very, very short sprint intervals, say up to 6 seconds, there's still some involvement from the oxidative phosphorylation or aerobic energy system. Now, it's not much, but it shows or proves the concept that nothing is purely anaerobic in nature. So if we look at some of this data a little deeper, we see that one single maximal 6-second sprint is in fact performed with approximately half energy originating from phosphagons, while the other half is originating from glycolytic pathways. So essentially we're saying that the alactic and anaerobic lactic, we're going to use those terms, which ideally we would phase out, but just for the ease of this video, we would use those terms to say, okay, most of the energy in the 6-second sprint is supplied from those two energy systems. Now this kind of gives a credence to supplementing with creatine. We're able to increase our supply of phosphocreatine within the muscle, and we're able to extend the energy system of our alactic PCR. So that's one supplement that you could take. This is not a supplement video, so we'll leave that there. But what's interesting is aerobic ATP production, so production from our aerobic energy system, is also activated during very intense exercise, and 70 to 100% of VO2 Max can be reached in an all-out 30-second sprint. So basically you can hit your limit of aerobic capacity in a 30-second sprint. Now typically we're doing a maximal graded test that lasts minutes to get there, but you can get there within 30 seconds. What's more interesting is while little energy from the aerobic energy system is used in the initial sprint, which I covered just before, approximately 50% is from oxidative process. So even within these short bursts that we would consider, say, an anaerobic lactic power or a lactic capacity interval, 20 to 40 seconds, you're getting approximately 50% of essentially from around 30 seconds onwards from the aerobic processes. So are we really training or developing that energy system using those protocols? Now again, the traditional energy system approach probably isn't that sound when we're talking about maximizing our conditioning for MMA. So we'll continue on. Because MMA is not just one sprint, we have to repeat these high intensity efforts in a 1:2 to 1:4 work to rest ratio throughout an entire fight. So now we've got to look at some of the physiology of what happens during multiple sprints. And there's a great paper by Gaetanos and his colleagues in 1993. They took subjects through brief sprints. They did 10 by 6 second sprints, maximal sprints, with 30 seconds recovery. They found that glycolysis, or in layman's terms, we can talk about the anaerobic lactic, but I'm gonna try to refer to these by these names here. So glycolysis contributes to 44% of total anaerobic ATP energy during the first sprint, but that drops down to 16% by the 10th sprint. So they theorized that aerobic metabolism, or those oxidative processes, takes over the regeneration of energy. So essentially, as we go further and further down the repeated high intensity efforts, it becomes more and more aerobic versus the anaerobic energy production supplying that energy. Essentially, we run out. We see this in a follow-up paper, Mark Glycolysis. I butcher so many of these researchers' names, I'm sorry. But essentially in 2005, he did a great review paper of multiple sprint work. Essentially, he states that sprints are predominantly phosphocreatine based, so are lactic, and exclusively aerobic processes for recovery. So as each repeated effort occurs, more oxidative processes regenerate energy as muscle glycogen is used. So in this case, we're often taught that when we're doing repeated sprint training, we want to improve our speed or power during those sprints. So that would be the anaerobic or lactic side. And we should do a lot of base work because the aerobic processes help restore our energy to be able to repeat them over and over again. So typically we think of, okay, we need to be really fit so we can maintain our power output or quality from sprint to sprint to sprint. Now, this can differ based on training background. So we can swing too far in one direction. So there's a really good paper by Hamilton and his colleagues in 1990. They essentially took team sport athletes, which are sprint based, and endurance athletes, two separate groups. They went through 10 by 6, the same protocol, 10 by 6 second sprints, 30 seconds recovery. Endurance athletes had the greater ability to resist fatigue and were associated with higher rates of oxygen use during sprints. So essentially they had more energy contribution from aerobic energy, and they were able to resist fatigue better than the team sport athletes from sprint to sprint to sprint. Sounds like a really good sign. Sounds like something that you would need as an MMA fighter. This is further reinforced by a 1995 study by Granier. They did a Windgate test and they had two groups, 50 to 200 meter sprinters versus a middle distance group, 800 to 1500 meter runners. So very, very fast sprinters, middle distance runners. They found energy contributions from aerobic and anaerobic processes were similar between groups, but sprinters had far greater contributions from the anaerobic side, where the middle distance runners had more from the aerobic. Now, again, the big caveat from this, the sprint-based athletes in both studies had far greater power output during the sprints. And that brings me to probably the single most important quality and my most important point I'm trying to make for MMA, and it's the ability to repeat high intensity efforts. And I've said this over and over again on the podcast and various videos. You must have high power outputs or high speeds to repeat maximal efforts. And there's a great quote, I'm gonna paraphrase it and butcher it. I don't know who it's from. I'm pretty sure it's from an old Soviet sports scientist, but essentially it's, I don't care how many times you can't dunk the basketball. Using a basketball reference in the MMA video, I know, but bear with me. So endurance-based athletes in these studies, they don't fatigue as fast, but using my analogy, they can't even dunk the basketball on the first one anyway. So why does it matter? So you need to find this balance between having the ability to recover between efforts, but also having the power output to actually have knockout power, shoot that takedown, finish that fight in the 8 to 14 second window or high intensity window that you have. So when we're talking about repeated high intensity efforts, typically we gear towards the repeat sprintability research, because that tends to be where most of it is. Team sports like soccer do a lot of research in this area because it's so important to outcomes in those sports. And typically it's ingrained in us, as I mentioned before, to improve repeat sprintability, we want to get faster at the sprints, but we also want to build this a little aerobic base to help recover between efforts. And that's typically done through things like your zone 2 cardio, potentially even long high intensity intervals, depending on what you're trying to do there. And it's also because recovery is an aerobic process and VO2 max tends to correlate with repeated sprint ability. But the thing is, are we training the wrong thing? Are we doing too much of the wrong thing to really improve this ability? And is repeat sprint ability even applicable to sports like MMA where we're not sprinting? So a good way to look at this is to look at repeat high intensity efforts versus repeat sprintability. Now the difference is repeat sprintability is only sprinting. Repeated high intensity efforts involves anything outside, or can include sprinting, but it involves anything outside of that. Tackling, grappling, takedowns, throwing power combinations, all these things count. Even jumps, throws, these are all repeated high intensity efforts. They don't involve sprinting, but they involve high intent and high effort. And there's an awesome rugby league study done in this in 2011 by Johnston and Gabbett. I highly recommend you check that out. Don't have the title in front of me, but Johnston and Gabbett 2011 in rugby league. And essentially they took two groups of rugby league players. They had one group do a repeated sprint ability test, 12 by 20 meter sprints with 20 seconds rest. The other group did the same 12 by 20 meters, but they also did a 4-second tackle sequence. Essentially hit the tackle pad similar to a double leg takedown, wrestle with the person for about 3 seconds after making contact, and then that was it. Didn't go to ground, anything like that. So it was all standing. And what they found was repeated sprintability, so performance during the repeated sprintability test and performance during the repeated high intensity interval test showed very poor correlation, so they weren't associated at all, with the repeated high intensity efforts having significantly greater heart rate and rate of perceived exertion. Essentially it felt harder. And I'm sure you just sitting there thinking of that can understand and have experience how much harder it is when you start adding in grappling components. Another study goes into detail where they actually isolate the components of repeated high intensity efforts, and they found that there's a greater performance decrement in the tackling and collision performance than the speed. So take the example of our test before, you see greater reduction in the tackle portion performance. So there might be collision impact, how hard you go into collision, etc. versus the speed decrement. So how fast you actually run the 20 meters. So what does this all mean? It means that instead of taking a traditional energy system approach to your conditioning, perhaps we may need to look at it in terms of central and peripheral limitations. And it's difficult to assess this on your own and without sports science equipment, but I'm going to try and give you some ways that you could look to do this without anything like that. So typically when we're talking about central limitations, we're talking about at the heart. Essentially the heart's ability to pump blood to the working muscles. And when we're talking about pumping blood, we're talking about pumping oxygen to the working muscles. When we're talking peripheral, we're talking muscles, and within the muscles, we're talking about things like blood vessels and mitochondria. And the reason we may see a greater reduction in tackling performance in these tests compared to speed is likely due to a greater peripheral demand from grappling. Obviously, you have the isometric contractions during that and a lot of forceful contractions. And the question becomes, can we address these limitations versus blindly trying to target an energy system? Because when we're just targeting energy systems, yes, we are inherently touching on central and peripheral adaptations, but we can be a little more fine-tuned and we can look to target these more readily, if that makes sense. And I'm going to dive into it now. So I'm going to refer to a podcast episode with Evan Picon. You can check that out on the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast YouTube channel. And he gives an observation on central versus peripherally limited athletes. So if you don't have sports science background or the devices to be able to measure this, here's some ways you could estimate or guess kind of where you fall. And he's found that peripherally limited athletes, so ones where the muscles essentially give up first, tend to have a range of loads during maximum lifts, for example, a 1RM, 3RM, 5RM, 10RM, etc., closely coupled together. So the weights very close versus being very spaced out as they should be. And, or they have a very strong endurance training background where, say, a longer race pace and shorter race paces aren't much different. So if you're running, say, an ultra marathon and a half marathon and race paces don't differ too much, then peripheral limitations are more likely. Essentially limited athletes tend to come from more strength sports backgrounds. So I know there are a lot of strength sports athletes transitioning from, say, powerlifting, weightlifting, bodybuilding, and going into combat sports. And these tend to be more centrally limited athletes, and they have larger discrepancies between, say, those 1RM loads as an example. So that's just something to bear in mind. So if you do come from a very long strength sports background, you didn't do much quote unquote cardio during those times, yeah, doing some zone 2, etc. is probably a good idea in those instances. But for the rest of you, that's up for debate, because we theorize, at least, that combat sports are likely more limited peripherally than centrally. And this is an opinion backed by research and application from Dr. John Babrai. He was just on the podcast recently as well, and Andrew Usher, whose protocols I'll go through soon as we get into the more practical section. But essentially they're doing a lot of peripherally targeted conditioning and seeing the benefits of this within combat sports. Now, Ed Baker, who was also on the podcast, also mentioned the same thing, that combat sports are likely more peripherally demanding than centrally demanding. Further, your heart has very little issue reaching maximum delivery in terms of oxygen, as reaching high heart rates is not that difficult for most people. Now, Andrew Usher and Dr. John Babrai, they've showed this recently in professional boxers. I did a whole video breaking down this study. So I'm gonna summarize it here. It's on the channel, but I'm gonna summarize it here. Essentially, they found that impaired mitochondrial activation at the beginning of the round, whether it's hitting the bag, pads, or sparring, essentially it's not switching on fast enough, decreased rate of muscle oxygen desaturation across rounds, which indicates poor recovery between rounds. Also had a decrease in the rate of muscle oxygen resaturation across rounds, indicating incomplete muscular recovery between rounds. Now, I'm going to dive into this a little further in the video, but essentially the muscles are not recovering between the rounds to be able to give maximum effort in the following rounds. And essentially it just becomes a compounding effect round over round over round as fatigue starts to set in. So how do we improve these abilities to recover between rounds? And when we're talking about our peripheral adaptations, we're talking about improving the muscle's ability to resist fatigue. And again, just like energy systems, there's nothing in isolation. Just because we're targeting a peripheral adaptation doesn't mean nothing happens at the heart level or nothing happens at the lungs, etc. But we can predominantly target one or the other. And typically the general rule is lower intensity is more centrally demanding, higher intensity is more peripherally demanding. That's the general gist. So central, we're typically training through what everyone's talking about currently, zone 2. We talk about long and short high intensity intervals as well to potentially cover that. Zone 2 might not be enough to move the needle for most combat sport athletes, especially if you're doing a lot of technical training already. Adding more zone 2 on top potentially isn't going to help you in the issue of the professional boxers from the study I just referenced before by Andrew Usher and Dr. John Babrai. Adding more zone 2 on top of that most likely won't help because it's a muscular issue. Now, there's a caveat to this, I'm gonna get to that too as well. There's nothing tried and true in the science. There's a lot of unanswered questions, but there are potential best practices that we can go down. So the problem with adding more zone 2 as well is it's a time consuming activity. At some point you need to add more volume to get the benefits that you want. So if you're already training MMA 6 days a week and you're doing your strength training 2 or 3 times on top of that as well, where do you fit that extra 30 to 90 minutes, however many times a week in that schedule? So that is one of the issues around that. Now you could do some kind of long or short high intensity intervals. Again, it's still another 30 to 60 minutes depending on what you're doing. It also depends on where you are in fight camp, etc. And I'll touch on that in a bit. So do we abandon low intensity conditioning completely? No, I don't believe we need to. I know some people may say that you should do none of it at all. Again, depends on how much MMA you're doing, but there was a really good paper, I didn't put it up in front of me, but it was a really good paper around essentially forming new blood vessels within the muscle. One of our peripheral adaptations, the ability to deliver more oxygen to the working muscle. And we see that the highest blood vessel to muscle fiber ratio is an elite endurance athlete, and who spend most of their time training at low intensities, 80+% of their time training at low intensity. They also show that high intensity training, like sprint intervals, actually blunt the new formation of blood vessels. So there's always a trade-off. There's always unanswered questions that we have, is that really that important? Or is focusing on sprint intervals to improve mitochondrial function more important? Again, there's a lot of emerging research around this and a lot of unanswered questions, but again, we'll continue on. So that boxing study, they showed that professional boxers lack the ability for the muscles to resist fatigue and recover between rounds. So doing more road work in this instance, as I mentioned, probably not a good idea. So instead, super maximal sprint work allows near complete muscle oxygen desaturation and subsequent resaturation. And that's exactly what we want, because that is what we want to train within those rounds. And here's the guideline for it, taken straight from Dr. John Babrai: 6 to 30 seconds of work. And when I'm talking work, I'm talking like ball busting. After doing one, you don't want to do another one. They've got to be that hard. And you're doing 1 to 2 to 1 to 8 work to rest, approximately. So, and then in total, you're aiming for around 1 to 2 minutes of work. Around about. So we're looking at some examples: 10 by 6 seconds. You can do that on the minute even, or you can do 30 seconds rest like they did in the previous research that I mentioned. 6 by 10 seconds with 20 to 80 seconds rest. 4 by 30 seconds with 60 to 240 seconds rest. There's a lot of options you can do in this. You typically don't want to go over 30 seconds. If you're going longer intervals up to 30 seconds, you only need to do, again, 1 to 2 minutes of total work typically. And the modalities you do these is important because you need the ability to exert maximal effort. So typically things like hill sprints, Dr. John Babrai also talked about on the podcast, 10-meter shuttle runs. So going back and forth in the 10 meters gives similar demands to loaded bike sprinting. So if you don't have a spin bike or a stationary bike, that is something that you can do. Just bear in mind that a lot of change of direction like that will cause a lot of soreness if you're not used to it. The mechanical demand from changing direction at speed like that will make your hips and calves, etc., very, very sore if you're not prepared. So easy way into something like that. Bike sprints, as I mentioned, is a really good one. So cranking the dial up there. For a traditional stationary bike at the gym, that might be level 15. So usually it goes from 1 to 20. It'll be about level 15 resistance. You want to try to get over 110 RPMs. You can do it on a spin bike as well. And Joshua recommends 2.5 turns of the resistance dial knob to get you there. Again, differs by spin bike. So you just got to have enough resistance to make it feel like you're working. And then another option that's not often talked about is jumps. And I'm going to touch on this in a bit after I get through some more of this as another option for sprint intervals and a way you can integrate it within your strength training so you don't even have to add anything extra. So one of the reasons that high intensity or sprint intervals are often not advised to do often is because research shows that adaptations stop relatively quickly. So a really good example of this is the original Toata study. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with Toata. Essentially 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off, times 7 to 8 reps. Most people who do Toata aren't doing Toata because they're not doing it properly. And to do it properly in the research, you're going to be exhausted by the 7th or 8th rep. And it's so hard that in their follow-up study, I think it was 66% of the subjects weren't able to complete it. So you got to move when you're on these bikes. But regardless, you're doing that 4 times. In these days, you're doing it 4 times a week for 6 weeks, which is pretty brutal. And what they found was essentially the aerobic capacity capped out at about 3 weeks. So once it got to 3 weeks, it didn't improve anymore. Anaerobic capacity got to 4 weeks and then didn't improve anymore. And we see that within a lot of the high intensity interval training research, you see improvements in these qualities happen within a few sessions or even a few weeks. So it comes relatively quickly and then it tends to cap out like that. But these potentially aren't the only metrics that matter. And there's also another potential issue with a study like the Toata study. So the first one is the idea that, okay, VO2 max maybe peaks after 3 weeks. And there was a study in 2017 by Takaki and Babrai in 2017. And they did 4 to 6 sets of 15 seconds hard sprints with 2 minutes rest, or 30 seconds hard sprints and 4 minutes rest twice a week. And they found that while VO2 max peaked at 3 weeks, similar to the Toata study, time to exhaustion, so essentially how long they could exercise at increasing intensities, was greatest at the final week, which was week 9. So even though aerobic capacity peaked out, like in the Toata study, they were still able to improve performance. And that is likely down to these peripheral adaptations. Again, the one major issue with no more improvements, say in the Toata study, is nothing changed for those 6 weeks. And that is a problem. Just like if you're going to go squat 60 kilos or 135 pounds on week 1 for 5 reps, and you do the same thing over and over and over and over and over again, at some point adaptation stops. And you need to increase the weight, increase the reps, increase the sets, do something to make it different. And this is where you can use sprint intervals to continually spur progress and how you can schedule it within your training. I'm going to run through my system now. I've actually got that, remember, in the MMA strength conditioning blueprint, and it is the funnel system. So the funnel system is about raising the ceiling, peak power outputs, deepening the well, again, improving essentially our endurance. Now, whether you're doing zone 2 long high intensity intervals or none of those is going to be dictated by your training schedule. But the high end training well above the intensities of the sport of MMA becomes vitally important, because you need that to be able to make submaximal efforts feel easier. You're going to improve some of these peripheral adaptations, where you're going to be able to essentially improve muscle resistance to fatigue. Now, typically you're doing these sprint intervals 6 to 10 seconds, and if you're out of fight camp, we'll start out of fight camp, you're typically taking longer rests. 2 to 3 minutes, could be slightly shorter, even 90 seconds, but you essentially want complete recovery between each effort so you can maintain that power up. Another day of conditioning could be zone 2 as more of a recovery modality, depending on how much MMA you're doing. If you're training twice a day, Monday, Wednesday, Saturday, Friday, and then you're training once a day on every other day, and you got a very high technical training load and a lot of intensity, you probably don't need to add anything else in. But if you needed to do something, 30 minutes or some easy zone 2 stuff could be on the cards there. If you're not training that much, potentially you want to look at more long, high intensity interval training options. You're typically looking at anywhere from 90 to up to about 100% of your maximal aerobic speed in those instances. And you're looking at, say, 2 to 8 minute intervals there. And that's, again, you're targeting more central adaptations during that. So that will be better for strength sport background fighters, but you're also getting some peripheral benefits on top of that. Now, you could completely remove that long high intensity intervals and zone 2 and go straight for a twice a week sprint interval approach. One day with longer rest, one day with potentially shorter rest, or shorter and longer work intervals, and you can play around with that. Again, if you have a very packed schedule and you need to improve your conditioning, that might be something you do. So let's just say a typical training week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, so your hardest days in MMA, let's just say Friday is sparring. You would do your first sprint interval on Monday, and that would be with complete recovery. So you're just trying to maximize power output. Tuesday would be optional lower intensity conditioning if you needed it. And then you would do potentially another lower intensity session, say on a Saturday, if you needed it. Or you could just do these sprint intervals on, say, Monday with full recovery, on Wednesday with less recovery, or you could do Monday as usual, but then after sparring on Friday. The goal is here that you're putting all your highest intensity stresses on one day. You don't want to go, it's a hard MMA training Monday, then I'm going to do hard conditioning on Tuesday, then hard MMA Wednesday, then Thursday easier, then hard sparring Friday, and then hard conditioning Saturday. You don't give yourself time to recover and rest, so it's best to try place everything within the same day. If you're in camp or getting close to a fight, you probably want to use the sprint interval training approach with less rest. And again, you could use that Monday, Wednesday, or Monday, Friday as an example. And by doing these sprint intervals, it takes about 10 minutes. You're giving yourself more time for technical training. And yes, they are intense, but they're not going to beat you up like a lot of other training modalities would. Now, there are some other unique methods you can do for sprint interval training that would essentially cover your strength training as well. So you kind of get a double whammy out of it. And that is high volume power training. I've done a whole video of this on the channel as well, you can check out. But essentially, you're doing approximately 30 to 40% of your back squat 1RM during the jump squat. And you're using these loads because they typically maximize peak power output. You can also use Olympic weightlifting derivatives. So 60 to 75% of your power clean 1RM can be useful as well. And you can do clean pulls, clean high pulls, etc. Jumps, in my opinion, tend to work best. Now, I've done this protocol as well, it kicks your ass. So just bear that in mind. The protocol is 2 to 3 times a week. I would advise only 2, potentially even only 1. And you're looking at 12 to 20 reps per set and anywhere from 90 to 200 reps per session. And now these are damn hard. These are all maximal effort jumps. That's what makes it so difficult. So I'm gonna give you a little protocol here that you can follow. Again, check out that video because I lay it all out. But week 1 is 4 times 5 plus 5 plus 5. So that's 5 jumps plus 5 jumps plus 5 jumps. In between every 5 jump, you're taking a 5-second rest, and you're taking 2 minutes rest after you've completed those 15 reps. And you're repeating that 4 times. Each jump has to be maximal. The goal is to try and maintain jump height for each and every rep. Week 2, you would do 4 sets of 12 jumps, so 12 jumps in a row with 1 minute rest between sets. And then once you've completed those 4 sets, you would take a 2-minute rest and repeat it again. And then for week 3, you would do 4 sets of 10 reps, but this time with 30 seconds rest between sets. And then you would rest 1 minute after doing those 4 sets, repeat that 3 times total. So that's killer. So that would be on your strength training days. So when you do your strength training, say on a Monday and Wednesday, you would use this. You would potentially do some upper body work first because you'd be too fatigued after this to do anything else. So maybe it's your upper body strength power, and then you would finish with this, and that would be it. And then essentially your high intensity sprint interval conditioning is done in that same session. You don't have to tack anything else on. So that's where I think something like this is quite powerful for MMA conditioning, because it layers in already what you're doing within the gym and you don't have to add anything extra. Saves you more time for MMA training. Now, just bear in mind, this is a damn intense training modality. You have to have your recovery down, your nutrition down, all of that, because yeah, this can leave you pretty sore initially. And if you're not used to jumping and jumping with loads, it's probably not something you would want to do unless you're already doing something similar where you're jumping with loads, etc. If you're on any of the Toata Fighting Underground programs within the app, you probably are jumping with loads already, so it makes sense. I also use this within the Grappling 365, which is a whole year's programming for grapplers in there, and MMA and all that. This protocol is also used. But before going down the rabbit hole of deciding what you're going to do with conditioning, there's some factors to consider as well. One is muscle fiber type. So there's a great study, or a great PhD from Levins and her colleagues in 2020. Essentially, athletes who are predominantly slow twitch recover faster after high intensity exercise, whereas fast twitch dominant fighters may take 5 hours to recover. So just bear that in mind. If you're more of a workhorse, quote unquote, grinding fighter, and I guess an example archetype, I think it would be someone like Khabib, who, yes, he has some power, but he's more known for his grinding style and not for his explosiveness. So he would be considered maybe more on the slower twitch side, where he could probably recover really easily from these efforts. If you're more on the faster twitch side, maybe we could think like Edson Barbosa with his fast kicks as an example. Someone like him may take longer to recover from sprint intervals. So most people are a mix, so just bear that in mind. But it's just something to think about, you know, if you're doing sprint intervals, but then hard MMA training, and then more hard MMA training, then more sprint intervals, you may run into a problem. If your MMA training is programmed well, where you do have lighter days, then you shouldn't run into many issues, but just something to be aware of. The other thing to be aware of is how often you're training. So if you're only doing MMA 3 times a week, is it better to spend the extra time incorporating skills into your conditioning and not worrying so much about some of these adaptations versus trying to maximize, say, peripheral central adaptations through various modalities? Something for yourself to answer. Depends, you know, are you competitive? Are you sort of training MMA 3 times a week and still looking to compete? If so, then I'll be trying to do as much skill stuff as possible. There could be shadow boxing, shadow wrestling as part of your conditioning instead of trying to do some of these sprint intervals. Are you just training MMA for fun and 3 times a week and everything else outside is kind of for more general fitness? Then again, if you're only training MMA for fun, then anything you do outside of it should also pretty much be done for fun, or you know, whatever you enjoy doing. If you're doing, like I mentioned before, if you're double daying MMA, intense training sessions, preparing for fights, now is the time to really look to maybe dial in what you're doing with your conditioning. And that would typically be leaning more towards these sprint intervals because they save you time, give you these targeted adaptations that are going to help you resist fatigue and leave you in better shape for training on the mats and in the cage. So I hope that gives you an overview of everything to do with MMA conditioning. It was a lot to break down. I'm hoping that it made it clear. I'm not so sure if I did make it clear enough to do MMA conditioning. So throw some comments down in the comments if there's anything you want me to try clarify. Again, make sure you pick up the MMA strength and conditioning blueprint. Down in the description, it will be the first link in the comment as well. And I'll see you in the next video.